This video has been brought to you by the generous channel members and lads over at Patreon. Thank you all for supporting me and my content. Whenever I would talk about the Bolsheviks and the Soviet Union on this channel and dedicate videos about them, one argument I like to commonly make is that the Bolsheviks never really won over the people as much as they bludgeoned them into submission, and that in reality, the Bolsheviks did not have as much public support as communists love claiming. The Russian Revolution did not just change the cultural and societal norms of Russia, but also its economy. The Bolshevik planned economic system had never really been tried before in history, and it certainly left its mark, and many YouTube videos about the Bolsheviks mainly focus on their rise to power and how they consolidated their rule, but few actually talk about the economic aspects. Specifically, since the Bolsheviks were so unpopular and in the midst of a civil war, how were they exactly making money, and how did they stay financially afloat? Because the Bolsheviks were not really in a good position economically in their first few years. They had to focus on nationalizing and implementing a never-before-tried system, all the while dealing with a war in the West and later on a civil war in the East. Now, a lot of conspiracy theorists, especially those identifying with a certain ideology, like to claim how the Bolsheviks were entirely funded by certain people belonging to a specific religion. And while it is true that the Bolsheviks were receiving foreign aid, this funding did not really make up the vast majority of their income, because as I discussed in my Lenin's Red Terror video, the Bolsheviks were on the verge of bankruptcy and had to resort to plundering church valuables to have something in their treasury, and if the Bolsheviks were entirely dependent and so massively funded by this one group of people, they would have never been on the verge of bankruptcy at all. So, I want to shed a bit more light on this situation, on how the Bolsheviks accumulated most of their money, and I can safely tell you all that not all of their ways were entirely clean and even used many unorthodox methods which you would see in common criminals. But before getting into those, let's go back a few years and see how they started off. The February Revolution, which saw Tsar Nicholas II abdicate and the formation of the Provisional Russian government, was spreading around Europe like wildfire, and one nation was particularly intrigued: the German Empire. The Germans saw the February Revolution as an opportunity, knowing that Russia was in a state of political instability at the moment, and if they had any hopes of winning the Eastern Front, they had to capitalize on this instability and fan the flames. And this is the infamous moment when the Germans put Vladimir Lenin on a train and sent him to Russia. But contrary to popular belief, Lenin wasn't the only person that was on the train. In fact, the Germans had gathered pretty much any Russian socialist they could get their hands on, both Bolshevik and Menshevik. For example, Julius Martov, an old Menshevik leader, was also on the train with Lenin. However, still, the train was mainly filled with Bolshevik revolutionaries, and Marxist activist Alexander Parvus would do his best to convince the Germans to go through with this plan, as he would state to the German minister in Copenhagen that in order to prevent a revival of Russian morale, the quote, "extreme revolutionary movement will have to be supported in order to intensify the anarchy." From the German perspective, this was a very valid strategy. While the Germans never really expected Lenin's revolution to truly become a reality, they mainly just wanted them to cause as much political trouble as possible that could present an opportunity to kick Russia out of the war. After all, getting Russia out of the war by any means was the goal. Interestingly, German support wasn't just limited to helping Lenin and the Bolsheviks get to Russia, but also financial support as well, and this financial support would form the backbone of the slow rise of the Bolsheviks around this time. For example, the Bolsheviks managed to purchase a private printing press for around 250,000 rubles, which would amount to $12.5 million today. With this new printing press, the Bolsheviks could now print propaganda in virtually unlimited quantities. Now, because so many files were later destroyed by the Soviet government, it's difficult to trace the money trail between the German government and the Bolsheviks. Lenin, for the most part, kept his hands clean, but there were a few suspicious telegrams to his accomplice Karl Radek in Stockholm, where he once admitted to receiving 2,000 rubles, and in another, Lenin requested quote-unquote more materials. Then we also have a Bolshevik agent named Evgenia Sumenson, who was running a German import business from Petrograd in order to launder money. Sumenson would be selling all forms of German luxury goods, and many of her neighbors even wondered how an unmarried, childless woman lived in a 4-bedroom flat that was fully furnished. Now, despite the lack of any direct evidence of the financial ties between the German government and the Bolsheviks, it's very much not hard to believe, because suddenly the Bolsheviks started affording all kinds of buildings and goods after Lenin returned, and Lenin himself even bought the famous Ksheshinskaya mansion in Petrograd, which was one of the grandest residences in the entire city. So, if we consider all the wire transfers and also the laundering of ruble profits from Sumenson's import business, the German government would have been able to transfer enormous sums to Lenin's party, ultimately amounting to over $1 billion in today's money. After the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks obviously could not live off of the German subsidies, and they had to take a proper approach to handle their finances now that they took over Petrograd and beat back the provisional government. And their first targets were, of course, the banks. For Lenin, a Marxist devoted to maximalist socialism, banks were target number one for property nationalization, as he himself had written earlier in 1917, quote, "The big banks are that quote-unquote state apparatus which we need for the realization of socialism." Soon after the revolution, private banks would shut their doors to the Bolsheviks, and while the state bank and Russian treasury stayed open, they refused to give funds to the Bolsheviks. The director of the state bank, I.P. Shipov, announced that the bank would withdraw over 600 million rubles to Russia's real government, including charities and soup kitchens for the poor. This obviously did not fly well with the Bolsheviks. So, the Russian state bank came under siege as the Bolsheviks were trying to forcefully take the funds, and as one witness wrote, quote, "The Bolshevik enforcers began bawling and shaking their fists in the faces of their adversaries, who consisted of the bank directors, some delegates from the Duma, the Peasant Soviet, and the workmen employed by the bank. Things looked nasty, but the directors found their champion in a giant peasant in a soldier's uniform, who roared louder than any 10 Bolsheviks and had a larger fist." With the Bolsheviks retreating and getting scared by a giant peasant, Lenin issued an ultimatum to the state bank. Unless the bank gave in, all employees would be fired, lose their pensions, and they would be drafted and sent to the front. The bank employees responded by literally just walking out in protest, and this now left the Bolsheviks in a funny situation because they could not access the vaults. So Lenin resolved to Plan C. Hostage-taking. Lenin ordered his commissars to take hostages from the Petrograd banking community, demanding 1 million rubles for each head. Eventually, this would pay out and the Bolsheviks would acquire over 5 million rubles, but the vaults of the state bank were still close to them, and even those 5 million rubles would be running out at some point. Since the Bolsheviks could not crack the state bank and acquire the state reserves including gold, they then turned their focus towards the private banks in order to confiscate their profits. And so, the next day, notices appeared all over Petrograd stating, quote, "To combat bank speculation and the regime of capitalistic exploitation, the late private banks have been occupied by armed forces." Thing is, the vast majority of Russians, ranging from upper and middle class, had their entire savings stored in these private banks, and by occupying them and taking all of the deposits, the Bolsheviks were basically robbing all of these people, amassing around $100 to $150 billion in today's value. Failing to get into the state reserves to acquire capital, the Bolsheviks instead focused their efforts on private banks, confiscating the private savings of thousands of Russians and leaving them all penniless. Trade is a very important component of every nation, importing materials that are needed for the development of the country and exporting surpluses in order to make more money. But in the early stages for the Bolsheviks, trade was especially painful. Because most Russian enterprises had been owned by capitalist banks that had been abolished in December 1917, and with the forceful taking of their money reserves, the Bolsheviks had practically choked off the cash from many major industries, and by that, gutted the industrial economy. So now that the factories had no more money and were not producing anything that could be exported, what was then left for the Bolsheviks to export? The only thing the Bolsheviks could really offer up on the market was some wheat, flax and linseed oil that was available for export via the Gulf of Finland. And this is where Sweden comes in. Believe it or not, but Sweden was crucial for the early development of Bolshevik Russia, since they were really the only nation they could trade with, and the Swedes obviously tried to exploit the position of the Bolsheviks as much as possible. Keep in mind, many important Bolshevik figures had strong ties and influence in the country, especially in the capital of Stockholm, and so the Bolsheviks would begin to smuggle old currency from the Tsarist and Kerensky era into Stockholm, and by the end of 1918, the Bolshevik couriers had deposited no less than 200 million rubles in Swedish banks to secure imports. In November 1918, Lenin would place orders for hundreds of millions of rubles worth of Swedish military imports, but even as Swedish factories cranked up war production to meet Lenin's demands, the Baltic Sea was still blockaded by British ships, and the Swedes could do very little about that. Because of the blockade, over the period of 10 months, only 5 Swedish ships carrying mainly civilian goods managed to get through the blockade and deliver the goods to Petrograd. But of course, the Bolsheviks could not just rely on the Swedes, as they at this point mainly survived through smuggling and not proper trade, which was just barely keeping them afloat. But in 1918, the Bolsheviks made a breakthrough in the economy by establishing the Supreme Soviet of the National Economy, which would later be renamed into the Gosplan in 1921. But for the sake of simplicity, I will call it the Gosplan from now on. The Gosplan was basically the brains of communism. With private property abolished, the state now controlled, in theory at least, all economic activity in Russia. And then, around mid-1919, the state bank, now renamed to the People's Bank, was authorized to print as much currency as demanded, and that same year there were over 255 billion rubles in circulation in Russia, and by 1920 the number would pass 1 trillion. However, even with the establishment of the Gosplan and the bank now actively printing currency, the state of the Bolshevik economy was still dire, and it would take much more to save it. Before the Bolsheviks had taken over, Russia was a major trade center in Europe and Asia, both in imports and exports. During World War I, Russian exports dropped severely, dwindling to about 60,000 tons compared to 300,000 tons of imports. But in 1919, Russian imports plummeted to only 16,000 tons and exports to only 1,500 tons. It was as if an entire continent, once central to the functioning of the world economy, had dropped off the map. Now, the decline in trade volume shouldn't be entirely blamed on the Bolsheviks and their economic management. Another major cause was, as I previously mentioned, the Allied blockade in the Baltic Sea, which made it hard for any goods to be shipped across the sea. Toward the end of October 1919, the British fleet began easing up on the Baltic blockade of Soviet Russia, stopping only ships that were carrying genuine weapons. But then in November, Prime Minister David Lloyd George announced to the British Parliament that the blockade would be entirely lifted and that the British fleet would be retreating. The news of this was like heavenly music to Lenin's ears, since now they could actually focus on trading rather than petty smuggling, and the Swedes were especially glad since they were still processing Lenin's order of weapons, which now could be freely shipped across the Baltic Sea. But still, even though the trade routes were open, by 1921 the Soviet state was already running out of money, as the last bits of Tsarist gold was shipped overseas and hyperinflation was ravaging the economy. The Bolsheviks attempted once more to secure some money by looting churches, which I discussed in further detail in this video here, but even that small amount of money they acquired was gonna run out at some point. And right now is the perfect moment for me to introduce you all to the one person who probably saved the Soviet economy, a Swedish banker by the name of Olof Ashberg. Ashberg was a dubious figure even before his business with Lenin, as his bank was on the Entente blacklist and all his assets were frozen in Britain and America. Ashberg was really good friends with Vladimir Lenin, and when the two met in Moscow in August 1921, Lenin, in a last financial will, granted Ashberg's bank to have quote-unquote exclusive rights to direct financial operations for the Soviet government in Scandinavia and Germany. Ashberg's bank was fully entitled to Russia's raw materials and petroleum reserves to be sold abroad as Ashberg saw fit, and there is a whole layer of irony here that you abolished private banks and brought them under your control, and then granted a foreign Swedish private bank access to a good portion of your economy and rights to sell off your materials. Gotta love it when they turn to capitalism in a last-ditch effort. Ashberg initially tried to make a deal with France, but that did not go so well, so instead he turned to another desperate nation in Central Europe, the newly formed Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic, after the Treaty of Versailles and a whole lot of political instability, was desperate for any kind of economic deal. And Ashberg capitalized on this, reeling the Germans in. And after some negotiations, the German Reichsbank agreed to establish trade and industry relations with Soviet Russia. But you see, due to Germany's position, they were willing to accept any terms offered by the Bolsheviks, as the Reichsbank would say to Ashberg that Berlin would, quote, take pains to fulfill the wishes of the Russian government, to the furthest extent possible. The entire winter, the Bolsheviks worked over the Germans, crafting terms ever more favorable to Moscow, and as stated, the Germans' lust for a deal was obvious, which enabled the Bolsheviks to write up almost any terms they wished. And so, in 1922, delegates from Germany and Soviet Russia would sign the Treaty of Rapallo, officially opening friendly diplomatic relations along with the trade agreement. But when the treaty was signed, the Germans were shocked to see that the treaty had a very fine print on it which they missed. The Bolshevik gold exports, which the Germans expected, had been completely cut off by Trotsky. In a sudden panic, the German trade team at Genoa sent an urgent telegram to Berlin to cancel the treaty, but it was already far too late, as Ashberg had sold off the last Tsarist gold reserves in Sweden to a French banking house. And so, the German Reichsbank would be getting no Soviet gold at all, practically exporting everything the Bolsheviks required completely free. And this came at a benefit for the Bolsheviks. By refusing to ship out gold to Germany, they secured just enough gold for the creation of a brand new ruble. Due to this massive success, Ashberg would open a bank in Moscow which was completely immune to nationalization, and continue to handle the communist regime's foreign transactions. And with this, the communist government now allowed private banks to be chartered, although under strict state supervision. From the very beginning, the Bolsheviks weren't financially independent and didn't receive money from the brave proletariat across the world, but instead from the German wallet that wanted to destabilize Russia more and more, being used as nothing more than a tool by this great imperialist power. And even when they managed to quote-unquote throw off the German yoke, the Bolsheviks kept making financial mistakes left and right, their biggest being nationalizing all the industries and looting the private banks in the midst of a nationwide revolution political chaos, which just further made their situation worse. Any money they managed to accumulate through smuggling, church looting, general robbery of other Russians, and the limited trade they got with Sweden was quickly being drained by their expenses, and when the Bolsheviks were defaulting and on the verge of financial demise, Lenin had to throw in the towel and give a private bank access to Soviet finances and raw materials. And to be fair, Ashburg and his bank did do a good job, and I would even go as far as to say that the only reason the Soviet economy didn't collapse was due to Ashburg and his quick decision making, especially his involvement with the Treaty of Rapallo, which gave Soviet Russia free goods and materials for practically no cost. Just as I mentioned, while after this private banks were allowed to resurface, they were under strict government supervision. But it still does not change the fact that Lenin brought back a capitalistic system in some form in order to keep their economy going, which is completely ironic if you ask me. The entire time, Bolsheviks were scraping the bottom of the barrel for any sort of income, even going as far as to loot churches for gold and other valuables. Had Lenin chosen to stick with the status quo and not allow Ashburg to do his business, I believe without any major reforms, the Soviet economy would have not survived, and it is only due to allowing forms of capitalism, i.e. the private banks, to exist and operate, did the economy manage to be elevated.